Chapter 5. To the Heart of the World. He lay among cold shadows untouched by the sun, unmoving. He was shrouded in a deeper night, aware of nothing save the hot life pouring out of him from the roaring furnace below his heart. It flooded his throat. He had to cough, and stiffened in agony as its white fires racked him, blasting thought. But as they ebbed, his mind cleared a little. His body felt cold, numb, immovably heavy, as if it had turned to metal. Dimly, he remembered the long sickness he had endured through lack of blood, though mysteriously healed of the wound that caused it. He knew, in a strangely detached fashion, that he must seek to staunch the flow somehow. But floating in darkness, lit and limed only by pain, he could not imagine how. Divorced from limbs, from senses, he forgot the use of them. Instinct instead led him inward, into the furnace glow and past it, to a flame that burned and glittered brighter still at his core, at the meeting of mind and heart. As into the works of his hands that secret fire was channeled, so now it spilled along his veins like solder of silver along some riven seam, to seal, to join, to set secure and weld. The white fire it overtook and quenched, damming its progress, ebbing the outflow of his life. Gradually, he grew aware that his throat was clearing, felt his breath grow deeper and steadier. Stinging needles of sensation returned to his heavy limbs. His eyes fluttered open, saw the familiar floor of a pine wood, and sagged weakly closed again. He was too weary even to be amazed at what he had felt himself do. There was still pain, but better far than the deathly numbness that had passed. If he had turned to metal, he had tempered himself anew. But as his body healed itself, his thoughts grew more agitated. They fluttered like dry pine needles in the wind, shivering, scattering, withering. Only two visions stayed fixed and clear: the dark wings shining in the rising light, and the tears that gleamed upon a milk-pale cheek. Kara. He was sure of her now in any shape. She had come, but to save him or assail him, which? Either was possible, but he feared the worst. The more so if she knew what he had been about with Lohi. Though surely she must realize he had succumbed only to seek a chance of escape, except that he had not. He had told himself that to justify it, and he had lied in his teeth. He wanted Lohi. He had ached for her even as he hated her, and the memory of it was a writhing torment. What had he done, lusting after an unhuman shadow? No, that at least was rubbish. That body was no false seeming. It was the expression in human terms of what she truly was, perilous and fair. And the peril had only added a sensual sting. Had that alone been enough? Surely not. Perhaps she had drugged him with those unguents. Equally possibly she had not needed to. He had gone too long without love, thinking only of Kara, hardly noticing other women. No wonder Lohi had made such an impression when she had thrust herself at him. Yet still, there had been something else. It could not have been, surely not, the thought of Kara and she. If they... He clamped down hard on that half-formed thought, and damned himself for it. But if he was honest, there had been something. Her vulnerability. Of all things, That was it. He had been drawn to her for all those reasons, even the worst. But it had been sympathy for her, sudden and instinctive, buried till now in the depths of his heart. He felt, as he had never once felt in all the fervor of their coupling, a sudden pang of compassion for that lost creature, half-formed shadow of a greater self, tormented by the urges of a body she both loathed and scorned to understand. She too was driven to love, yet for all her boasting, she could not possess that love, save by force. Kara belonged to neither of them, whatever bonds they might impose, but was at heart only herself. Now, when it was too late, he had come to understand. But he doubted if Louhi ever would. Till then, he had thought of her only as trying to ensnare him. But he wondered suddenly if Louhi might not have been drawn to him in just the same way. Weak and feverish, wrapped in his imaginings, he failed to hear the footsteps till it was too late. Those who made them were practiced hunters, and accustomed to moving quietly. Only the sudden crash of bushes upslope alerted him, and the guttural bark of triumph. He wanted to spring up, but hesitated. Better they thought him unconscious still, and stayed off their guard, especially if they sought to carry him off. Instead, he was left lying. Puzzled, he let his eyelids fall open a hair's breadth and saw them, tall Ekwesh warriors standing casually by, some 4 or 5 at least. One pointed with his spear to a long dark stain upon the steeply sloping forest floor, and they both laughed, a short, cruel laugh. Then he understood. That strange stain was his own blood, and they thought him dead already. As well he had lain still. If they left him, if they did not seek to plunder his body, then one grounded his spear in the soft earth and plucked a short axe from his belt, and Louhi's words came back with sickening impact. They were about to execute her command, and he did not even know whether he could move. But the footsteps crunched among the needles a span from his head. He had no choice but to try. With an agonized groan of effort, he thrust himself up on his arms and lashed out desperately to ward off the blow he feared. None came. He managed to lift his head, and was astonished to see the axeman frozen in the act of raising the weapon, his eyes glaring wide, the clan scars standing out livid on his graying cheeks. From his fellows came only yells of sheer terror. A blood-boltered corpse, as it appeared, had come to life, and there were few things the Ekwesh feared more than the dead. For if their victims could arise, they had much to fear indeed. Spears clattered as they fell among the bushes, and the axe dropped from its wielder's hand. Had Elof been whole, he might then have ventured escape, but the effort even of rising was so great he could only stumble back against a tree, retching with the sickening reek of clotted blood that choked his mouth. Dimly, he saw the moment pass, the flicker from fright to fierce resentment in those cold eyes. Resentment at being fooled into showing fear. As one, they snatched up their weapons to blot it out, and with faces twisted into sneering masks of anger, slowly, contemptuously, they closed in around him. The sound then might have been a bird cry, a whistling soft yet shrill, and they paid it no heed. But Elof had heard it before, and it woke wild memories in his muddled mind, told him the best thing he could do. He threw himself flat amid his own blood. A sudden, soft susurration filled the air, and his enemies turned uncertainly. Then they yelled in earnest, and threw up their arms to ward their heads. But the hail of stones that came whistling down upon them through the pines brooked no such slender shields, and shattered both together where they struck. Elof saw one warrior's brains dashed completely from his skull. Another danced grotesquely under a dozen impacts, a dead pulp before he fell. The axeman whirled about with 3 arrows through his leather cuirass, wrenched one out, sank down, and died with it in his hands. Elof, braving the stones to grab his axe, saw that it looked familiar somehow. Graceful, yet roughly worked. Ekwesh raced about the clearing, one with an arm drooping limp from his shoulder, but they found no way out. Arrows and sling stones felled one, the other made a mad dash at the bushes, stopped short with a horrible yell, and sagged down upon the spear that transfixed his stomach. The sight was too much for Elof in his weakened state. He was violently sick, and almost fainted with the pain it caused him. He lay helpless as feet rustled across the clearing, and he was seized and lifted in strong arms. A strong odor flooded his nostrils, familiar yet unpleasantly altered, a scent he knew grown rank and harsh. That spurred him enough to force open his eyes. But he thought he was wandering in fever then, for the first face he looked upon was Rock's. "Easy there," said Rock breathlessly, as Elof sagged with a shock in the arms that held him. "Gone to hell's own trouble to get you out of here. Don't go turning your toes up on me now. You see, damn it," he added swiftly to the shadowy shapes behind him. "He can't even talk, let alone walk. We'll have to carry him." "Not yet," said a harsh, deep voice from behind him, and he was shouldered aside. A burly shadow took his place, slightly shorter than he, but as broad or broader. A hard hand clutched Elof's hair and forced back his head so that a face could stare into his. A dark, bearded face that seemed twisted out of a mass of browned cordage, set with eyes of black opal that burned beneath heavy brows. A fine fillet of twisted gold crowned them, and the unkempt beard bristled over a thick golden collar. Those eyes glared deep into his own, and the sunken cheeks seemed to grow hollower still, as if eaten away by those fires within. There was no trace of mildness or mercy in that look. It was hard, proud, suspicious, and above all, it was voracious. "Well," said a voice whose accents had the same half-familiar ring to them, but by the face, even by the odor, Elof had already recognized the race of the speaker. The words were heavily sarcastic. "What token can you show us, smith among men? What marvels to amaze us?" Elof spoke with difficulty. None but this." And reaching inside his torn tunic, he pulled out the little oval of onyx that the great Duerg Ansker had hung around his neck. Gnarled fingers plucked at it, rubbed it, the opalescent eyes peering closer and looked up in startled belief. "When stole you this? By what right bear you it?" Elof forced himself to stand upright, though the trees seemed to be swaying too violently around him. He looked the Dark One in the face and demanded, I am the mastersmith Elof Valentor. Will you not give me your name? Taishkaise Hito. Duergar voices rumbled their astonishment that a human should speak any tongue of theirs, and he relaxed a little. He had been afraid they would not understand him. The gold-crowned one glared at him a moment, then nodded curtly. Hey, Tayak, Uz Nai, Ildrainaya, Koroila, Lay. Then hear my answer, Lord Ildrian. That stamp I was awarded by right as a journeyman, after 2 long years of service, and by the achievement of mastery was confirmed in that right. Again, he heard astonished words, mingled with disbelieving sniggers, but he concentrated his gaze on Ildrian. For myself and my helper, I claim the shelter of that right. Is it granted, or do we tarry here till the man-eaters return? Kazto, mayat dailas. Out of the shadows around him they crowded in around him, and there were fewer sniggers. Elof saw for the first time that the gold-crowned one seemed surprisingly ill-clad for any of the elder folk, let alone one of authority. He wore a shirt of the fine-meshed Duergar mail, ornamented in gold, but it looked to have been altered from one shaped to fit another's form, and the leather breeches beneath were worn and stained. But then the garments of the others were as rough, and even less clean. Bags of game, bunches of roots, even a brace of hares hung from their belts, and many of their mail shirts were ill-fitting. Only their weapons were well made and richly ornamented, even when they hung from rawhide baldricks. He felt his mind whirling with the puzzle of it, and suddenly that dark face was all he could see. It seemed to hang unsupported in space, and he forced himself to hold those unreadable eyes with his own, until at last they lowered in a quick, unwilling nod. "We waste time indeed," growled the voice. "The price is accepted. Tal yazga na zaivar, naza, skar yanej." Elof let himself collapse with relief. Rock supported him and demanded what had been said. "He said we should go with them," croaked Elof, and added, as quietly as he could, or ordered it, rather, and told us to hurry up. The idea of that seemed suddenly hilarious to him. He could hardly put one foot in front of the other. And that stupid ringing in his ears was drowning whatever Rock was saying. Unease swelled in him. But what did he mean, the price? Suddenly the trees were whirling around him, and the ground surged up beneath his feet. For much of the time that followed, he hovered uneasily in the shadowland between consciousness and unconsciousness, dimly aware of being borne on some kind of litter, swaying on broad shoulders, of lines of tall trees looming over him, with moon and stars between them. At other times, he was swirling once more in that awful tide rush, or seeing Loki's face contort with wrath, or feeling that sickening agony of the sword thrust, or walking paths that were darker and more confused still. Then, very suddenly, his eyes were staring up at a circle of blue sky, and he was wholly awake. Rock was bending over him, water bottle in hand. As Elof stirred, he nodded as curtly as Ildrian and sat back against a tree, but gave no greater sign of relief. "Well," he said, "had a good sleep, have we?" Elof stirred and looked around him. All he could see were bushes, and above them, picked out between black outlines of limb and leaf, patches of deep blue sky strewn with the rose-hued clouds of sunset, and the high summit of some cliff or crag of grayish stone. It gave him a welcome sense of peace, uneasy and short-lived perhaps, but still peace. The air was full of a strong resinous scent, and as he moved he saw he was lying on a long heap of soft spruce tips, a comfortable woodland bed. There were trees in the background, but Rock sat at the base of the only one near, a substantial pine, with Gorthar and their packs by his side. "Yes," Elof said, and though dry, his voice rang already stronger in his ears. "Yes, I have. I feel strengthened."
"And so you should," said Rock severely. "The rate you've healed. We guessed Louhi had muffed it, but she didn't, did she?"
He saw the look that crossed Elof's face and sat back.
"Calm down, my lad. Take your ease. We're safe enough here for now. Ildrian and his lads say Louhi doesn't control this land. They're holed up in a nice, shady spot nearby, waiting for night. But I thought the sun might do you more good, and they seemed glad enough to be shot of us."
Elof sat up gingerly, feeling his head clear. "Rock, how did you fall in with that crew? What happened to you after?"
"After you lost hold of your shape? The powers know how you held it that long, but I'm bloody glad you did. Well, I was swept off, whirled down. Then I saw the Tarnhelm go by me."
"You saw it? Did you get it? Rock, is it safe?"
"Easy does it there. Aye, I found it. I saw it dashed away among the rocks and dived for it as it sank. Got myself swept off in a current for all my pains, but I brought it ashore all right. Much use I thought it without you. And I didn't know whether you were alive or dead. Then, our friends found me."
He snorted.
"Friends I call them. That's giving naked truth clothes. They're not fond of men, these ones. They'd have settled me on the spot if they hadn't come upon the helm and seen there was something about it. That made 'em more ready to listen. Afraid I sounded off a bit about it, and you to bait them into helping me look for you. They wouldn't have cared a toss otherwise. But the Equesh got to you before we could. Tried to warn you, but, well, too late. And there you were, prisoner, and there we were."
Elof smiled. "My own fault. At least you tried." Rock grimaced.
"We saw you taken, but they wouldn't attack the patrol. Not in that open land. Can't blame 'em. There were too many others about. But they tracked you neatly, every step. And when the man-eaters took you to that castle, we were near enough to see you then, and me close to tearing my hair out, or rushing into that tower after you. But they said we'd get closer round by the rear walls, and that I might scale them by the mountain's flank and slip in, that place being built to keep folk out to the front."
"Slip in?" laughed Elof weakly. "Rock, my lad, what do you ever hope to do in there? You must have seen it as a crawling hive of the man-eaters."
"Well,"
Rock grinned, a little self-consciously.
"I thought I might just nose around a bit, make myself out to be a thrall, like—"
"Ass," growled Elof, to cover his real feelings. "Even after weeks on short commons, you'd still look like the best-fed thrall I've seen." Rock chuckled quietly.
Maybe they fatten them up now and again. But I'm glad you saved me the swink with that acrobatic act of yours.
You saw that?
From a ways down slope. Couldn't miss it when it started raining Ekwesh. Then you. Hella's teeth, I thought you'd had it that time. Born to be hanged, you are. But it seemed as well to look a bit closer, just in case. And you saw the rest.
He shrugged.
Mind you, it's as well these tykes aren't friendly enough to be interested, or they might start thinking. From a scar front of your breastbone and another back of your spine. Quite a wound, and we all saw it made. Might even say a mortal wound. Yet, here you are. It's happened again, hasn't it?
Elof swallowed and nodded, remembering the unhappy gulf that strange incident had opened between him and his friends. Yes, it has. And I still don't know why. Rock reflected.
See now. You can be hurt just like the rest of us, that's certain. Right from your first day's prentice at the anvil, when you'd smite your thumb or burn your fingers. I've seen it. And you wouldn't so much as swear, not aloud, so bent you were on acting like our master.
He chuckled at the memory, though it made Elof shrivel.
But you bled right enough, and took as long as any to heal. And as a grown man, too. Except these 2 times. Now, what was so special?
Then his eyes widened with wonder, and Elof began to see the drift of his thought.
Both wounds made with swords, and both swords from under your hand. You, who so often make your work more powerful than you mean. As if you'd poured so much of your craft into them, that they'll not wound you properly, but heal the breach they've made. Seal it with the fire that forged them.
He whistled softly.
It sounds damned unlikely, but of you, I could believe it.
Elof shook his head. Ugh, Rock, I set no such virtue upon either blade.
There's spells in your very blood.
That I've left the forest floor well enchanted. Listen, Rock, it may be as you suggest. Who am I to say? But this I know. It did not stop me shedding that blood. I'm getting weak and starved. Is there any food to be had? Rock chuckled.
Very well, then. You're on the mend.
He pulled over the packs, rummaged within them, and handed over leaf-wrapped lumps.
Let's see. We've meat, bread, some kind of roots. Strange, but wholesome enough. At least they haven't stinted with food, our short friends. And no more they should. The damned price they...
Elof, tearing ravenously at the tough gray bread, looked up sharply. Price? And now I remember. Ildrian said something about a price being accepted. What price, Rock? And for what exactly? Rock twined a dangling lock of red hair around his broad fingers.
Well, that's the rough side to it. Hadn't meant to mention that till you were better.
Rock, I'm better now. What price?
Better. Gray as that bloody bread you were, and weak you still are. What's the use? The price. Well, it's that helm of yours. No, do you lie back there and let me explain.
You've got it? And yet you're bartering it away?
Elof, hear me out. It was the price of our lives.
Elof exploded. Rock, you stupid bitches get. That helm's the most powerful thing left me. It's mine. And to hell with your damn fool bargaining. I've got to have it, do you hear me? Got to. I can't hope to catch Kara without it. Rock's eyes screwed up till they almost vanished, and his cheeks flamed.
Catch her, is it? Where's all your repentance fled to, then, Sir Cock-a-hoop? Haven't you thought a sight too much of catching already? And would we be here in this stinking midden if you hadn't?
Abruptly, Elof bowed his head, and Rock blew out his breath impatiently.
Master Smith, I'm sorry. But what was I to do? I couldn't rescue you on my own. I can't work that thing. What profit in hanging on to it and losing you then? They had it already anyway. There was nothing to stop them just hanging on to it, taking it without another thought and leaving me high and dry, or slitting my throat. And so far, at least, they've been honorable. They've taken nothing else. Nothing we'd had in our packs, or anything.
Elof nodded, though he was still sick at heart. He ate again, but without gusto. As the last sunlight faded above the bushes and the first stars began to appear. The crag seemed to loom larger in the dark, a steep shadow against the luminescent twilight. He reflected that with the Duergar, also appearances could be deceptive. Their character had many facets, not all to be judged by the standards of men. They could be a dark and suspicious folk, selfish even towards their own. Though he had never known them half as sheerly brutal as the worst among men. Perhaps in cases like this, they were only being less hypocritical. Ansgar and Ills exerted themselves to respond to men on their own terms, and most younger Duergar copied them. But even Ills, generous in heart as she was herself, might consider such a bargain only somewhat rigid and in no wise dishonorable. And as you say, Rock, they might have taken the helm away with no risk. But much good may it do them, for though they have smithcraft enough to use it, they do not know the ways. Let them only try, he added grimly.
Dark comes,
said a harsh voice. He looked up sharply. There stood Ildrian and his gaggle of followers. And in the deepening shadow, the lined faces seemed even less human, the black eyes stony and opaque. From Ildrian's fingers the precious helm dangled, and Elof's heart leaped and labored. He could see some damage, dents and links offset here and there. To his fury, another had caught up Gorthar in its scabbard. The Duergar lord motioned to one of his men, who pushed through the thorny bushes to the root of the crag, parting them gently. The thorns seemed to make no impression upon the leathery hands. What more he did was hidden, or else it was another of the Duergar beyond their sight. But his intent became apparent. For as they watched, the shadows upon the rough face of the crag deepened and darkened, and seemed to flow into one another. A whole section of the stone, apparently unbroken a heartbeat since, was inching silently back, swinging aside upon some hidden hinge. Even as it opened, one of the Duergar stepped into the blackness, tinderbox in hand. Light kindled, a mote of red he touched to the wall, and suddenly it grew to a flower of mellow gold that sparked off another and another, a racing line of trembling flames shining a dim, warm light upon a wide chamber of stone, long and deep also, its bare walls ornamented with deep-hued scenes of beasts and the chase. Old and faded they seemed, but at the rear a great grille work of metal shone untarnished by time, and the lamps themselves glittered in their own light.
"Silver, gold, and crystal," whispered Rock. "And yet they're clad like peasants."
Elof felt the hair prickle on his neck. He was suddenly very near the answer to his puzzle, and he did not like the picture that was taking shape in his mind.
"Come," said Ildrian gruffly. "Enter our ancient halls. Be our guests as you were of our kin over sea, and feel honored, for no man has been permitted sight of these gates for many a lifetime."
Two Duergar bent to Elof's spruce-lined litter, but he half rose suddenly, forestalling them. Ildrian's brow knitted.
"Why linger?" he barked. "Where else can you go? Here, there are no Zaliki near. But in the lands around the Eaters of Men, we'll be combing the woods in wrath for you. Fools! Shall we leave you to them?"
Elof hesitated. Warmth and light allured him, and a thirst for the security of old memories. He strained his eyes, and it seemed to him that beyond the inner gate, he saw a tunnel sloping down to a dark mirror of still water, a sunless lake on which the dancing flames gleamed like gems in coronet. By that tranquil shore he yearned to lie and rest from need, from thought, from love. He had endured too much of all. They were bound up in his agony, and he pined only for surcease now, and recovery. But that other picture was becoming all too clear. He remembered another king under stone, and how loath he had been to let strangers depart, once they had passed such mountain gates as these. If anything, he trusted this one less, with his hungry face and burning, devouring eyes. Behind such defenses, in apparent shelter from the turmoils of the outer world, it would be all too easy to forget that not only one's own folk might be entitled to justice, or that there might be some good, some right, greater than their immediate gain. "What is it you want of us, Lord Idrian?" he asked quietly. "That we show you how to wield that helm? But that was never in our bond, was it, Rock? Well then, since you forced us to it, we shall hold you to the letter of it. I will not teach you the use of that helm, here or below. I will bind myself to shape you as worthy a price in its stead, if you so wish. But I will make you nothing till I hold the helm in my own hands. Nor will I enter your gates till I have it. Hold the helm if you will, and much good may it do you. But if you are sensible, you will let me ransom it from you with other works."
"The helm you shall not have," spat Ildrian. "You who dwell above, creatures of fierce light and wayward airs, think you we are blind? Or fools? Will you seek to wrest our price from us, and fob us off some trash of your tinkering? The elders of your own land you may cozen, but we shall guard what is ours. No helm,
nor anything more from us, save blade and blow. Get you within, or die. Dull iron gleamed as arrows sprang to bow, stones into sling, and the Duergar sprang forward, their eyes chiefly on Rock, not the sick creature they had been carrying. But he sprang up with ease, straight at the one who held Gorthar, felled him with a single blow, and snatched scabbard and belt even as they dropped. The black blade sang into his hand, and he stood there defiantly, swaying slightly. Rock stepped quickly to his side, and he rested a hand on his shoulder. So, the Duergar race forgets its honor indeed, rasped Elof, in so fell a voice that Rock jumped, along with all else. Ildrian's glare smoldered, but he raised a curt hand, and no shot was loosed. We do not forget, he said contemptuously, even to human filth. Get you from here, now, whither you will, to the cliffs or the ice for all I care. Linger here but a moment, and we may justly slay you as intruder and spy. And the helm? Demanded Elof. Adjitse! At Ildrian's curt command, the Duergar turned and strode by him within the gate. Teeth gleamed behind the tangled beard in what was no smile, and he hawked and spat on the grass beyond the door. Against the flickering light, his hunched figure seemed to swell with the very intensity of his malevolence. Bargain is bargain. What we have, we hold. Dalbudye. Even as the Duerg spat his last dismissive contempt at them, the huge slab of stone was swinging out across the soft light, and severed it with the smoothness of a sigh. For an instant, the crag face was seamed with glowing gold. Then it faded and vanished. Sheer fury overcame Elof's weakness. He staggered forward and hammered the stone with his sword's pommel, but it rang as firm in one part as another, nor could his skilled eye and finger detect even the smallest breach. Come away, growled Rock, dragging him back. You heard what they said. Another minute's about the extent of their honor. Then they'll shoot. He jerked his thumb expressively at the heights above, that might conceal 100 arrow slots, or 1,000, and draping Elof's arm about his shoulders, he bore him almost bodily down the slope. At the foot he paused, gasping, and they sank down amid some clumps of yellow-flowered broom. The first thing Elof said was, I could break that door. His eyes wandered upslope. Oh, more than mere skill shields it so. True. There is some great persisting virtue, something deep-set, very ancient and strong. But, yes, give me the time, and I could break it. Aye, said Rock dryly. And to what end? To give their archers a clearer shot? You couldn't storm that place with an army, my lad. Anyway, they'd only repair the door soon enough. Elof coughed and pressed his hands to his breastbone, wincing. Would they? I wonder. Rock looked at him. Anyhow, if you were so eager to get within, why'd you balk so at entering? I was suspicious, aye,
but it looked as if you'd some good reason not to trust 'em. The blades behind their backs or whatever.
I did see something, yes. Not blades. It was the contradictions, Rock. The gold and the crude clothes. Ills has told us often enough that the first coming of men to these lands, many thousands of years ago, drove almost all her folk to flee oversea. So these Duergar must be the descendants of those who remained, and of so close-knit a race, who would remain? Chiefly the outsiders, outlivers, solitaries, eccentrics, the cloven-minded. No great number among the Duergar, those least likely to come together in any kind of community. And the Duergar need to live together to support their great arts and skills, more even than we do ourselves. What then? Separated, weakened, without the solid core of their folk? Those remnants must have grown weaker still, their skills and knowledge dwindling. Some united at last, or more likely their descendants, but by then it was too late. Too much was lost, and they were too few to recreate it. Poor, sorry remnants. All their ancestors' realm to wander in, all the riches they had had to leave behind them, yet aware that they could not shape anything half as fine. So though they walk among lamps and gates of gold, Ildrian and his folk, their descendants, must live as hunters and gatherers, being too few and too unskilled to farm their mountain slopes properly. And so also they grow greedy and avaricious, even more than the worst of their kin in our land. They are hoarders more than makers, fiercely inward-looking and jealous. I did not dare put our lives in such hands.
Should have thought they'd jump at your offer of another price then.
Admit me to their forges and betray the decay of their own craft? I, a human, and a pupil of a true master of their kind?
They could have learned from you.
They're too proud, too afraid of being betrayed. If once we had entered those gates, they would have found reason to keep us there, honor or no honor. Rock frowned.
I'll give you that. I doubt they'd suffer it even from Ills or any other of their race, the black pride of them.
He sighed, and his red hair flopped listlessly over his face as he bowed his head dejectedly.
Well then, here we are, leagues from nowhere, adrift and helpless as ever we were. And without the helm. So ends my bargain, and a piss-poor one it was, it seems.
Elof laughed, though it stabbed his ill-used stomach muscles, and clapped him on the shoulder. Never say that. From under that axe, it looked fair and good to me, and I've my pack and tire and Gorthar. So if we've lost the helm, yet we have the gauntlet and all else. If my poor hammer's left to Lohi, I've the other half of the armoring in exchange, and count it cheap at the price. Most of all, we've our lives. That and a few bites of food. And we've seen times enough when we'd have sold the one for the other, huh? Rock chuckled with reviving humor.
True enough, and no haggling. But it's the poor trade that galls me still. Those chiseling bastards hadn't even the grace to set us on a good road.
Perhaps there is none, or none as they see it. But they did tell us something without meaning to. They told us that Lohi does not control this land, and later said that no man had been permitted sight of their gates for many lifetimes.
So?
Elof grinned. So that implies that once men had such sights, which tells us that men and Duergar once had dealings, however slight. That once there were men in these lands, and since these ragged Duergar alone could not keep the Ekwesh out of this land, almost certainly there still are. Strong men at that. Rock whistled softly and looked around him. The sun was all but gone now, save for a few pale streaks upon the dark overcast, and a last slash of fiery orange at the horizon, barbed with the silhouettes of the trees.
Maybe. May well be. And enemies to the Ekwesh could be good friends to us. But where? Which way do we turn in this wild country?
Elof gathered his strength and hauled himself shakily to his feet. We are still high among the hills. Here. We should be able to find some vantage point without much effort.
Aye, but can you?
I told you. I'm better. Come. Rock's doubts were evident, but he did as Elof bade, and sought only to support him when he tripped over tangled roots or loose stones in the soft earth slopes. They forded a small stony stream that chuckled as its cold fingers tugged at their ankles. Elof drank deep of its waters, and seemed much refreshed. Slowly but steadily they climbed again, and very soon espied a pale notch of sky between the shadows of the crags. Towards this they climbed for their vantage. The slope was very steep, but it was carpeted with tough grasses whose tussocks gave hands and feet good purchase, and they soon neared the top. On the ridge they paused to catch their breath and await the moonrise, for there was little light to see by through the overcast cloud. But Elof, looking down, could make out that the grass on the northward face of the slopes was far less lush, low stuff unfit for grazing. Bare rock showed through the soil in places. It made him uneasy, and he strained his eyes northward. So it was that when the moon arose he saw its first glimmer alight upon a rough terrain of dark hill and mountain, the same as that through which the Ekwesh had borne him, broken only by the winding silver threads of broad rivers and the sparkle of the mountain snow-caps. But above them another light leaped up, like a mist of silver spray from a breaking wave, and it hung there, pale and clear, gleaming upon the clouds till they too seemed turned to rivers of ice. Walls of winter looming above the world, and Elof, in his wounded heart, cursed the day that first he saw it.
The bloody ice glow, said Rock. This close?
Silently, Elof pointed. Between two of the most distant snow-caps shone a speck of something whose light put them to shame, a glittering frost jewel in the brittle air. Its herald, he said softly, or its child. It is there, and it advances. It is causing the snow-caps to spawn new glaciers of their own.
So much for the north, said Rock, after a moment. Westward lies the castle and the seas, and the man-eaters. Our best hope there'd be to pass their cordon somehow and steal a smallish boat. Don't much reckon on that, do you? Thought not. Which leaves east and south.
They turned, and looked out over a dimmer, softer landscape, where crag gave way to high hill, and the dark tangle of lush forest softened the contours of the land. There was no trace of snow. A light mist, or perhaps a passing rain shower, made the distance hazy, yet they could just make out there the mellow gleam that might be some wide river or lake. From south to east, as far as they could see, the view was the same, a generally lower and well-grown range of hills, and beyond it, haze and uncertainty.
"Looks all right," said Rock. "Gotta be better than the north, anyhow."
And if there's anywhere better yet, inhabited lands even, southwards where they will be, agreed Elof. There lies our road to the south. Yet, even as he said it, he cast a last glance up at the crags. He could not quell his heart's ache to recover that miraculous work which had given him a brief glimpse, at least, of the keen heights and dizzying freedom of a power. He doubted that he could ever shape such another, without the unparalleled library of the mastersmith Milio to hand, or the ancient lore of the Duergar. Worse, without its aid, he could hardly believe he would find Kara again, or keep her if he did. To memories of bright light and rushing air and fair laughter he bade farewell, and to the free sharing of strange shapes and sensations, a world untrammeled by mere human limitation. Sorely as that life had taxed him, he yearned for it, as for a fair dream too suddenly shattered. But hard upon that yearning came a gust of bitter self-mockery and disgust, and it drove him so fast down the slope that Rock was hard put to keep up. So it is that the Tarnhelm fades from the chronicles. Yet, though it has left this tale, it has not left all tales, nor the legends that grow out of them. In the end, after many years, perhaps many lifetimes, it seems that the Duergar learned to unleash at least some of its powers, and though many claimed it as the wisest of their work, its true maker was never wholly forgotten, for it was to become a great treasure among the fading elder folk of the north, and at last pass on to those fated few who inherited their hoard and the shadowy name they earned, and were to bring its tragic history, at last, to an end. Of the three great works of Elof's corrupted youth, a second had now vanished from the world. Fit prentice pieces as they were to herald the mightiest of magesmiths, yet each in its own way could not escape the taint that was then upon him, and each in that way worked great evils. Even as the greatest of them, the sword of the mind, drove whole hosts of men to needless suffering and death untimely, so the helm, worker of secret change, became an instrument of treason and deceit, and the arm-ring, binder of love and tainted the least, came none the less to bind love in coils that stifled and tangles that cut. Broken as it was, the tale of its ill-doings is not yet done. No account remains of the passage of Elof and Rock southward through the hills and the forests. It must have taken some few days at least, since so many heights and valleys lay in their way, but it seems to have been uneventful. The land was empty, is all that is said, and the game was scarce. What this means to them can be guessed, for they had only the little food the Duergar gave them, and no easy means of hunting save Rock's bow and few remaining arrows, and the effort of healing was draining Elof's body. On the other hand, they walked free and alive when all too often they had stood in deadly peril. and they had both strong spirits to sustain their flagging frames. It must have been warm summer in those forests, the air tangy with resin, and flowers glowing among the pine needles on their floor. They were still afoot and in no bad heart when they reached the wood's edge and came out among a few scattered trees onto a bare and stony upland slope, leading to what seemed a hill crest. It was a warm midday, and beyond the crest only clouds glided by. There were no more treetops, and as they looked to either side, it seemed that there also the wood was thinning and diminishing. With growing excitement to steady their shaky limbs, they clambered up the slope.
Let's hope the downslope's easier,
wheezed Rock, face purple and glistening as a berry. But as they drew nearer the top, they realized that there was no downslope. They were at the edge of a cliff. And it was no mere hillside crag, such as they had come upon on the Meneth-Iathan, but part of a long, irregular wall of golden stone. As far as they could see from east to west, the forest grew down almost to its edge. Then they came cautiously to the cliff edge, keeping low lest some unfriendly eye catch them against the skyline. But when they reached it and looked out, they forgot all that in wonder at what they saw. For to their right, westward, they first made out another such line of cliffs, and thought themselves overlooking some deep valley. But as they rose higher and looked out east, they saw that line of cliffs turn away from them and plunge deep into cloud-shadowed distance, till they became no more than a dark streak upon the horizon and merged with it. And below them, all the broad lands between lay spread out clear as on some vast map, some boundless living tapestry. For if this was indeed a vale, then it was the greatest in the world. About the feet of the distant cliffs were green woods, glowing with the lighter hue of seasonal trees. But these soon gave way to low hills, plains and grasslands, wider than any Elof had seen since he crossed the desolate country off ancient Morven. Through them, a river flowed out of what seemed to be a chain of small lakes, widening swiftly as tributaries, like branching veins, led into from the cliffs. As the cliffs turned away into the distance, so it snaked after them, growing ever wider and wider, till it seemed to become a great lake again. And if distance did not deceive him, it broadened still further, became like a sea lapping at the horizon's lip as if eager to spill out across the sky itself. Many long islands were set in it. Yet it was not this sight alone that set Elof's pulses racing, but what he saw thus far off on the edge of sight, extending between grassland and river, a rolling country mottled with a regular mosaic of many shades, chiefly green and brown. Upon this side of the river the same pattern repeated itself in the lands eastward, woodland, grassland, mosaic, till they blurred together. So fine was that mosaic, and so great the area it covered, each still found it hard to accept it could all be fields. Around great cities he had seen such checkered patterns of fields, but from here they seemed like flecks as fine and as numerous as the lichen upon the rocks beneath his clutching hand. So small they looked, that he might almost reach out and scrape them away as easily. Yet he looked upon the works of men.
It's a rich land,
said Rock, his voice unwontedly soft.
rich and spacious. Makes home look pretty damned small, doesn't it?
So it should, Elof retorted, equally softly. And so it should, Rock. Or have you not guessed where we are? To what place we have come, and by what paths? I know it, Rock. I know this place. I know the stone of these cliffs, layered and tortuous like that. I know the colors of those fields, the span of the river beyond them, the contours of that hilly island there, even how the winds play about the cliffs as they converge. See? You can see it in the swirling of the clouds there. Rock stared at him, astonished.
When you've lived all your life half a world away? Or
Very darkly,
is it that you can look back along the river to some life you have lived before? How in hell's name else could you have set eyes on anything here?
through page and paper, a scroll and book, words inscribed. They showed me this whole scene, little by little, a word here, 2 words there, but I never realized it. I saw only the parts, never the whole picture. But now, here, I see it. It springs out at me from every corner of my reading. So strongly it shaped the minds of those who wrote. I piece it together from 100 casual examples, 1,000 chance comparisons. The cliffs, the colored fields, they came from manuals of mining I pored over as apprentice. That island there from some old treatise on mapping. The river and its currents from clauses in some leaden-heavy charter of commerce. The winds blew about the pages of ancient almanacs. Rock, from a fraudster's scrawls on divination, I could tell you the very stars that will rise. He gazed out solemnly over the expanse before him. This is a cradle, Rock, a mighty cradle, for it bore within it high beginnings. It is our cradle, Rock, the birth and nursing of all that makes us what we are, our folk, our histories, our wisdoms, our follies. All that has driven us since our first youth began here. All that we achieve now is measured against the best of this place. This below us is the Vale of Charis, greatest of all vales, and greatest of all rivers is this which flows through it, the salt flood, Yescianus, the river at the world's heart. In this vale, by this vast stream, for centuries beyond count, was encompassed the high and ancient realm of Charis, the city of the lowlands, the very heart of the world itself. Rock paled as he contemplated that awesome prospect, and his voice grew choked.
Is that so? Then I'm given a name I've longed for since I first heard those names. In old tales my poor mother told me. To see them as you name 'em, that shakes me to my core. How my lord Kermorvind envy us, worn and wan as we are. He'd change his chair of state to be with us. But then, what lies there now?
Elof shook his head, and his voice sank to a whisper. There the words have no answer. 5,000 years have passed since the fleets left this land, found our own. Yet longer than that it had endured already. More than twice as long, some say. More than 10,000 years. Therefore, it may endure still. Yet, if so...
"What is it?"
demanded Rock.
"Your face just went like a wet midsummer, clouded over."
If so, Elof swallowed. If so, then the ice comes hard upon it to be so close. And its strength must have waned terribly. Do you not know now that fortress to which they took me? Yet you've sworn by it often enough. That must have been the high gate of Karis. Legendary strength of strengths, built to deny any enemy access to the river or to the valley mouth. And who holds it now? Rock's hands clenched on the stone as if to clasp it to him, to deny it furiously to others. Elof saw the horrified anger seething in him, and understood it well. To the Southrons, far more than to the Northerners among whom he had grown up, the ancestral land and all things about it were sacred, imbued with reverence, enshrined in memory. They had made it the measure of all their aspirations and the warranty of their oaths, the more so as they thought it lost to them among the impenetrable shadows of time. And no part of Karis was more sacred to them than the High Gate.
"That's the bloody worst of all. In her damned cold clutches. And if that's fallen, what else stands? Will we just find a nest of her thralls here, too?"
He stopped, and blew out his cheeks with sudden relief.
"No, surely not. Or else this land'd be lousy with them, too. No, it's gotta be as you reasoned it. There's men in the old country still. True man, and enemies of the ice. Might be glad to know they've kin fighting the same fight, eh?"
It's possible, agreed Elof, straining his eyes for any trace of life across all that wide vista. We should seek a way down these cliffs, I think, in any event. Where else is there to go? Rock shrugged.
"Where indeed? Short of drawing conclusions at the High Gate."
He peered over the brink and shuddered.
"Damned if I'm beetling down that. But it's lower to the east here, more of a slope than a cliff. And the sooner we get you some food and rest, the better. Feel up to another stroll?"
They grew weary indeed as the day wore on, and they clambered and scrambled along the overgrown margins of the cliffs. Hunger shook their limbs, and though root and berry grew more plentifully than above, still there was little to lessen it. It remained a wild land, with no sign of man's hand upon it. But Rock in particular refused to be downcast, and kept searching the landscape all around with squinting intensity that earned him many a stumble over obstacles nearer to hand, and once or twice great danger at the cliff edge. His persistence, though, was rewarded when the sun was still well up in the sky. For as they came down a steep, bushy slope towards a deep gully in the golden cliffs, he let out an abrupt whoop of triumph, and pointed to tiny flickers of light in the distance.
"That's Mael, or I'm an ape of Hela,"
he swore.
"Yes, See there. Soldiers, and clad in no Ekwesh fashion either.
Elof shaded his eyes and let them focus. Yes, they are pale-skinned.
I'll take your word for it,
said Rock good-humoredly. He stepped forward, waved his hand, and let out a hail that went echoing away down the gully's water-eaten walls. Elof's keen eyes saw pale specks of faces look up, hands point, and a great scurry break out. One went running back down the steep slope. A messenger, perhaps. "Ah, Rock," he said, shaking his head. "I wonder, was that wise? You're not normally so trusting. I would sooner have watched them a while from hiding first, weighed them up." Rock shrugged a little shamefacedly.
Well, maybe you're right. Though I'm sure there'll be no friends of the Ekwesh at least. Do you go hide then, and watch over me.
Too late, I fear. They've seen two, and finding only one would breed suspicion in the mildest breast. I'll come down with you. No, don't bother yourself. The slope looks easy enough, and I'm feeling much better. He knew well that it was as much concern for him as eagerness to gaze upon Karis that had made Rock impetuous. But he had spoken only the truth. The sun was shining, the air was mild and filled with strange fragrances from the sun-warmed bushes, bay and thyme and myrtle. And whatever his doubts, whatever the weakness of his limbs, it was no effort to relax. As they reached the gully's head, Elof heard a distant jingle of metal rise on the light breeze, the crazy carillon of mail and harness, and the rolling clatter of hooves among the loose stones. A cloud of dust rolled up over the edge of the slope, and out of it, with a roar like a breaking flood, a squadron of horsemen in light mail came charging up the gully, long rows of pennons fluttering from the lances upright in saddle racks behind each rider. Behind them, on foot, ran a file of mailed soldiers with halberds leveled. Across the gully the horse spread out, lances poised to sweep its length, while their leader, with the foremost of the footmen at his stirrup, came trotting forward to loom over Rock and Elof.
Well, what marvels have we here?
He did not deign to lift his visor, but it was a young man's voice, clipped and scornful. He eyed their tattered and blood-stained garb.
What men are these, that he lets them stray about the borderland? Or could it be that they're masterless men, good for naught outlaw vermin, out for pickings?
That was evidently what he believed.
Those men there, let them declare themselves person and purpose, in the name of the king.
Curt and ominous as the words were, the travelers exchanged wild glances, hearts pounding. For though the speaker's accents fell strangely on their ears, they had understood his words, and all they had implied. Peculiar though it had become, it was recognizably some form of the southern tongue he spoke. "With no hesitation, friend," exclaimed Elof, and saw the men start, listen, and then understand. "We sought you with that in mind, for we are charged with an errand to him. But we are fleeing the Ekwesh."
"Ho ho!"
exclaimed the leading foot soldier less harshly, for all that his voice was rough, and with a glance up at the rider he advanced upon them. The other footmen looked scarlet-faced and panting, but he seemed to breathe easily enough. The face below the helmet was lantern-jawed, of late middle years, and weathered the hue of brick. His nose and cheekbones were a mess of scarlet veins, and wispy, colorless eyebrows shadowed very cold blue eyes. His expression was still suspicious, though he was evidently taking in the marks of their exhaustion and Elof's blood-stained clothes.
"Been mixing it up with the man-eaters, have you? Well, but what you expect if you go straying off into the islands, hun? As soon clamber up hill as quim. What sort of way is that to be getting to my Lord King?"
He stiffened suddenly.
"Don't tell me the bastards bore you off from the lowlands."
"They took us some way northward," said Elof. "A week's march, maybe. For that is where we came ashore, where our ship foundered. We're not of your land, soldier, but from its sundered kin across the oceans. We come as emissaries and friends." The mounted man straightened up in the saddle so sharply his armor rattled, and the other soldiers exclaimed in a blend of excitement and disbelief, cut off at once by a peremptory wave of his glove.
"A marvel indeed, it seems,"
he remarked to the footman.
"An emissary from all the way across over the seas, he claims."
"I do," answered Elof calmly, but with weight. He seldom minded how he was addressed, but he was not going to defer to this young puppy who would not address him directly.
"Well, now," remarked the footman, with an elaborate show of courtesy, "that's fine, very fine, because, by Veria, an emissary's got no cause to conceal his name and quality from lawful authority, has he now? From a captain of the first line like his lordship ere."
"No, indeed," said Elof, increasingly nettled, though he knew well he could not reasonably expect to be believed at once. "I make you free of them. I am Elof, called Valentor, mastersmith of my land's guild, and this is Master Rock, my friend and helper." He raised a hand to his neck, striving to stop its trembling, while the captain swung himself dubiously out of his saddle. "As Ernest, my stamp of rank." Captain and sergeant took one look at the carved jewel Elof held out to them, then looked hard at each other.
"Ah,"
began the captain uncertainly, but the sergeant seemed in no doubt. He rapped out an order, and behind him the ranks rippled like mown grass, the horsemen bowing low to their saddle bows, the footmen hastily kneeling. So did the sergeant, but upon one knee only. The captain, after dithering a moment, bowed low from the waist. Rock cocked a sardonic eye at Elof.
"Know any more tricks like that?"
"I'm not quite sure what I've done," admitted Elof. He had murmured, and in northern dialect at that, but the soldiers were on their feet so fast he feared they had overheard. Then he understood. The salutation had been impressive but perfunctory, a purely formal honor to someone they were given the benefit of a considerable doubt. These folk evidently valued appearances.
"Still, shows they've a sound respect for smithcraft, anyhow," remarked Rock. "You ought to like that."
"And something about the land itself, perhaps," answered Elof quietly. "If so, I like that less." Captain and sergeant were conferring, while the horses began to stamp and chafe in the lines. Now the captain turned back to them and doffed his helm, revealing a square, slightly boyish face below blond curls, with a nervous flutter at the corner of one eye. "Well, noble sirs," he began, a fraction more politely, "I regret, though it is hardly surprising, that I have no orders concerning such unexpected guests. This is too deep for me, or any, I think, save my lord the king himself, and his court smith." His eyes, lighter blue than the sergeant's, were studying Elof's face for any sign of dismay at that, and themselves grew uneasy at what they read there. "I am taking steps to send you to him at once, and speedily. The transport that landed us awaits still at the riverhead. Orgus here will command your escort. For your own safety, please be guided by him in all things, however restrictive this may seem. As you have had occasion to find out, these are troubled times. We'll provide horses for you, or, if the master-smith cannot ride," he added, considering Elof's blood-stained clothing and forestalling an angry outburst from Rock, "we will happily draw him down in a litter." However polite, it was a command. Elof shrugged, unwilling to be hoisted about like a sack of potatoes. "Of course. If it is not too far, I will try to ride. But ere we depart, we have endured days with little food and stand in need of some." The captain nodded curtly, gestured to the sergeant, who snapped his fingers at his men. They fumbled around belt and harness, and produced the usual scraps and morsels that patrolling soldiers will carry with them. They were mostly young men, some very young, their faces much like any of their contemporaries in Morvenhall, but without the open quality he might have expected there. When he thanked them, they neither grinned nor saluted, and some bowed their heads in an instinctive way that irritated him. Then, at a word from the captain, two dismounted and held their stirrups for Elof and Rock. Evidently, they were meant to do their eating on the move. Elof wavered as they helped him up. The saddle was not the kind he was used to, high-bowed and stiff. The captain rode past and the troop wheeled into formation around them, Rock urging his mount clumsily up to Elof's side.
"All right," he growled. "I know you rode a bull bareback and all that as a lad, but
"I'm fine," said Elof impatiently. "Just let me get some food in me." But the captain barked an impatient order, and the troop wheeled about as one, fell into file, and went thundering away downhill. The travelers' mounts responded with the rest, so swiftly they almost toppled their riders from the saddle. There would be no sudden escapes on these well-trained beasts. Over the slope they clattered, stones scattering and rattling away in little avalanches beneath their hooves, and a cloud of yellow-white dust boiled up around them, sparkling with mica. Not even that, though, could keep Elof from the food he had been given. It was rough, some kind of tough, dark bread, and even tougher morsels of dry meat and cheese. But it heartened him so much he had to take care not to overeat, and be sure Rock had his share. He needed it, for the ride that began thus soon gave him cause to regret his pride, and ere it ended left him slumping in his saddle, borne up by Rock at his side. At first, he could still take notice of the view from the path, looking down upon low and tangled scrubland, and then the tops of dense pine woods, cool in the evening haze. But by the time the troop went thundering among them, the light was failing, and his sight blurred. They looked strange, stunted. So much lower and thinner they were than the pines of his own land. And though their familiar scent drifted around him, it was oddly mingled with others he did not know. Even as the soft bird calls among the branches sounded strange. To his exhausted mind, he rode through the distortions of a feverish dream, subtle and sinister. He doubted even the flecks of light that flickered in the distance, flitting this way and that about a great bulk of shadow beyond the trees. He half feared that even the solid shape of Rock at his elbow might suddenly distort and melt in some nightmarish shape. Only when he heard the sharp challenge of a sentry, in much the same words as in his own land, did he realize the shadow was a wall, and that they had come to some kind of strong place. He heard sounds he knew well from campaigns with Kermorven, the familiar firelit bustle of a busy military post.
"Stand! Who goes? Under which king?" under Lord Nighthyde, answered the captain coldly, and about his business. Anahan, captain of horse, with— The hesitation was slight, but it rang in Elof's hearing. Arrivals to take ship for the city at dawn. So pass us to the landing stage and look lively about it.
They clattered on through a harrow arch. The wall was high and had a strange look about it, but in the torchlight Elof could not be sure why. They passed between a cluster of buildings, low and austere, and into the looming shadow of a tower. It was of no great height, not more than 4 or 5 stories, but very strong in the building, and fortified all around its peaked roof. It reminded him unpleasantly of the master-smith's lair, and that added the final touches to the nightmare. The riders passed through another gate, and beyond the lights, darkness fell deep again. He could not think why the hooves sounded so hollow all of a sudden. When they helped him from his saddle, heavy-limbed and shaking, he stepped down into the darkness as if it were deep water. He awoke, shivering, beneath a pile of coarse blankets that reeked of horse. Looking up, he saw only the canopy of a leathern tent, silvered with dew. Beyond its open end, the air was gray with heavy streamers of mist. A chill droplet struck his bare neck, and he reached about in sleepy haste for his clothes. They lay beside him, foul enough to make him shudder as he pulled them on. But he was heartened to find his pack and sword with them, all intact. Whatever the captain had meant, they were not prisoners to be disarmed yet. There were voices not far off, indistinct yet tantalizingly familiar. He swung onto his feet, then staggered and fought wildly for balance. A moment he thought himself still sick, then realized that he stood upon caulked planking that truly was heaving gently underfoot to the tune of 100 muted creaks and groans. Gingerly, still striving for his balance, he peered through the opening and stepped out. He found himself on the deck of a beamy barrel of a boat, of the old-fashioned kind called a cog, with high bows and stern, which might have looked comical had they not been topped with catapult platforms. Beyond the stern, and the sail that hung limp and slick with damp, the top of that ominous tower glimmered through the mist. They must still be at mooring. From the bows, where the smoke of a brazier entwined with the mist, Rock's voice hailed him to break his fast. Argus, the sergeant, was there also, seated crag-like by himself, and some 8 troopers lounged around the decks, wrapped in cloak and blanket. 3 or 4 dark-haired sailors, busy with line and tackle, were cursing them roundly in a rolling speech. The soldiers seemed not to know it, or they might not have lain so docile under its lash. But Elof understood. It might have been the Nordeny speech of his boyhood, for all the strange turns and twists it sometimes took. Rock made him known to the shipmaster, Trigcar by name, a smooth-faced old man, so expressionless and bland that Elof guessed he was enjoying his crew's barbed humor.
"It's only the wee breeze of dawn we are after," he remarked, "to shift this murk. And then away down river to the capital. What river? Why, Hyrionus, to be sure, that we northerners call Aran. You've come down into the vale of Hyrionus till Aran. Down Hyrionus to Ysginias lies our road, and down Ysginias to great Keris, the city herself."
A cool breath touched Elof's neck as he named that august name, as if it had some summoning craft of its own. Suddenly the mist serpents were writhing weirdly in a freshening wind.
"By your leave, gentles,"
said the shipmaster hastily, and strode past them to bellow orders at his crew. Elof turned to watch, and found the sergeant at his back. He must have moved noiselessly as a cat to listen in on their conversation. Pointedly, he turned his back on the man.
So, not a foot further to ride,
Grunted Rock, as the square sail flapped and fluttered above them.
which will at least give you a chance to recover a little.
Thanks, Rock, but I'm well enough now.
To gather your strength, then. You may have need of that. We both may.
Elof made no answer to that. They leaned on the rail and watched the cog pull away from the fort at the riverhead, that seemed to materialize now out of the thinning mist. Suddenly, Elof leaned over and peered, and swore under his breath. You see that?
What?
Elof glanced at the sergeant out of the corner of his eye. I don't want to point. Just look at that wall.
Karis, yes. You can see it against the tower, the buildings. They're ancient, of weathered stone, but that wall's spit new.
He watched the emerging sunlight play on the raw face of the stone for a moment, sucking his teeth as if at some ill taste.
So, even well within its bounds, Karis needs strong walls now. Those reavers have a long reach.
The cog glided out peacefully into the center of the stream, riding easily on the freshening wind, and the moorings soon vanished behind a slight bend in the river, hidden by the vale's steep flank. But for some time the tower could still be seen above the pines, and it loomed longer in their thoughts. Before that first day's end, the pines themselves had fallen away behind. Tired of having his every word marked, Elof was wearily content to sit quietly and watch the changing banks of the vale. By day, and at ease, he no longer found its blend of familiarity and strangeness so unsettling. He soon began to notice other trees among the pines, of the broad-leaved, seasonal kind, and as the hours passed, he saw their dominance established. Straight birches, some of kinds he did not know, were joined by ash and elm, and what he learned were chestnuts, but few of them approaching the heights he was used to. The same was true of the beeches, and Elof was beginning to think that this was a poor land for trees, when the cog had to steer hard to avoid the course of a great willow uprooted and toppled of its own weight into the river, almost blocking it. Its pale hair still lay outspread and waving upon the water like the locks of Saithana, daughter of Velamo, and branch and twig raked the cog's hull as it passed. There were more willows then, massive brooding trees trailing their gray crowns in the water like aged and brooding powers of the forest, casting their shadows cool and dank along the banks. And as the land grew less hilly, they passed the first of the great oaks, gnarled and ancient and regal as kings of old, their broad branches overspreading the stream and diminishing it in their shadow. Not even in Tapaiula, the forest, had he seen any greater or more aged, and his awe grew when he saw that an immense avenue of them stretched out before him, flanking the river as if it were a road. When Rock pointed out the weathered remains of a high marker stone, with a carved figure of distant half hidden by thorny undergrowth, his suspicions were confirmed. The oaks had not simply grown thus. They had been planted beside that stream, surely at a time when it was a much-used thoroughfare. They asked Trikgar, though taciturn by nature, he had taken some fancy to them when he found they both spoke the northern tongue and were experienced mariners. He agreed.
But how many 100 years since, who can say? Not me, gentles, not me. And there's few know the old Arran any better. These were wild lands in my grandsire's day.
So they passed downriver, sped along by the swift wind behind them and the current beneath, and saw the wide lands of a great realm open out upon either hand. Yet the works of man in it were few. By the next morning, the only trees in sight were the tall willows, set at clear intervals along the bank. Beyond them, the steep forested vale had opened out into the green hills they had seen from the cliffs, low and rolling. In the course of that day, these in turn flattened out into a wide grassland country, so dismally flat and featureless, and so thickly carpeted with green, that even the Arran was almost invisible beyond the next bend. Yet though the grasses bent and nodded in waves under passing windrows, so that the cog seemed to ride not the river, but an ocean of green, still they lacked the ocean's boisterous thunder, yielding only a soft rattling hiss, the dry play of stem against stem, husk upon husk. It soon grew monotonous, even with the bird song. Never before had he heard the trilling songs of larks arising, but they were poor substitutes for the wild gull cries of his homeland. Nor could he warm to the harsh merriment of raven and carrion daw, and the scream of raptors stooping for the kill. Of other creatures, or of men, they saw none. The land, though rich, seemed unpeopled, and though once or twice towers had lifted from hilltop or river promontory, their windows gaped empty as skulls. They did not look that old, but to most of those on board, they might have been made with the stones of the cliffs, those too impossibly ancient for any man to know their history. Only when they passed one such tower, and saw that still visible among the grass at its foot were the blackened remains of a village, did the travelers begin to understand. "Don't tell me the Equish have struck this deep into the land," exclaimed Elof grimly. "And so long ago? That's been ruined many a year."
"Never believe it," said Trikgar behind them in the northern tongue. "That's not Reaver's work. More's the shame of it. That now, gentles, that was put down in the times of the last Ysmerian kings, maybe even when my grandsire was young. A bloody business, they say it was. But then the line of the bull would never spare chick nor child in such a manner. Called it breeding rebels if someone did. Never recovered properly from those times, did this region."
"The last Ysmerian?" Elof pricked up his ears. "Then what line rules here now?" Trikgar blinked casually around before replying, but the sergeant was, for once, not on deck.
"Did you not hear? Lonunen, the line of the bull, and well named." "We've none of that name in our land," said Rock. "Still, at least it's not the Bryherens or Herons as they were."
Trikgar whistled.
"Have a care, my lads. There's a connection. The Lon are a bastard offshoot of the Ysmerian, but they've Huron blood. Why, the king's own mother was almost the last of them. Their line's gone now, too." "And good riddance, I don't doubt," muttered Rock. "They had some bad lot, on your side of the ocean also. Oh, they stood up to the bulls as they had to the Ysmerians, and that was something, but the bulls broke 'em."
He stopped. Argus had surfaced again, and though he was too far off to hear, the old shipmaster fell silent and would say no more. All through that long summer day they glided across the grassy plain under a sky in which sunlight and cloud contended, and saw never another work of man. As night came, the clouds thickened, and the air became cooler. After the evening meal, Elof and Rock sat by the brazier only a short while before returning to their deck tent, which was considered better quarters than the noisome lower troop decks of the cog. So the next morning they were already awake and shivering before dawn, eagerly gathering by the brazier again to claim fried hunks of some kind of peppery blood sausage, and bowls of small ale mulled and spiced. In the gloom, the clouds hung in gray overcast, shot with streaks of darker gray, as if to mirror the grassland beneath. The sunrise took them unawares. A rift had opened in the clouds, and the sun came pouring through it in radiant glory, turning the air to hazy gold. And looking out across the yellow-green waves of the grassland, it seemed as if they now mirrored the clouds, for among them also a golden seam opened, threading away in rippling fire along the eastern horizon.
"Yes, Giannis," said Trikgar quietly, "but 'twill be even ere we reach it, gentles. Harder sailing from thence, not like on this mild wee stream."
Elof smiled. "I think we may endure that, shipmaster, having survived the open seas." Trikgar shrugged and said no more for that time. Only long after did Elof wonder what deeper meaning might have lain behind his words. Near the mouth of the Hieronymus, they at last began to see the distant wisps of smoke that marked human habitation, and here and there the grassland flecked with herds of horses or cattle. At length they passed by their first village, a straggle of houses in a shallow dell that was evidently home to drovers or herdsmen, by the great spread of animal pens that surrounded it. Beyond that, a plume of smoke arose, but as they came closer, it became evidently too big to be a town, or anything of human origin. "Why, it's a fire mountain!" exclaimed Elof. "Just like in the Nordenbergen of my old home. But not so fierce, I hope." For once, the sergeant joined in the conversation he was listening to. "Wouldn't be so sure of that, gentles," he said grimly. "My home village was in the shadow of another such, for there's many in the land. We'll be passing a good few. Well, that village is under a man's height of ash now, and it seems there's vines being planted on top already. Fierce enough for you, sirs."
"It'll serve," said Rock dryly. "Why'd your people build so close to it in this wide land?"
The sergeant scratched his head. "Now, there's a thing I used to ask as a lad. Seems that an awful time back, 300 years even, that mountain wasn't near half that height, that size. And I can believe it, by Vera, for I've seen others spread too. But that's the way of 'em, isn't it?" Not long after that, they sighted the first town, or rather the grim castle that dominated it. The scatter of streets was hardly visible behind its walls, until they drew much closer and could make out the roof peaks. And these walls were manifestly not new. They looked as old as anything over the oceans. The whole community was first a fortress and a place of strength, clearly placed to dominate the river mouth, around which white sails flocked like so many wings. As they drew nearer, 2 longboats with 5 oars aside, flying a flag of purple and white, and heavy laden with men, detached themselves from the flock and steered towards them. But at Trikegar's order, a dark bundle was sent soaring to the masthead, and there broke out into a long pennant striped in black and gold. At once the longboats went about and vanished among the other ships. "No tolls to levy on a king's ship," grinned Elaf. "Do you note our colors? The same as Kermorvan's."
"I noted more than numbers of men under theirs."
"That's the holder of Burhiron," said Trikegar, tilting his white head at the castle. A hard hand he lays on such trade from the uplands as goes not through his town and his tolls." "And the king permits that?" asked Elaf in surprise, knowing how Kermorvan would react if any noble of his sought such advantage. Trikegar glared around, but the sergeant was watching them with a benign, bloodshot eye.
"The king needs peace and loyalty from the lords of outlying burgs," he said,
and turned pointedly to his helm once again. Elaf and Rock exchanged glances, but they too chose to guard their tongues. For that time, though, hard thoughts were forgotten. They were beyond Burherion town now, and Yscenius the Great opened up before them. It was more like the approaches to the sea itself, thought Elaf. Gulls flocked screaming about the banks, and the freshening wind carried an unmistakable tang of salt coasts in the clear air. More like wide estuary or sea lake than river the waters looked. Already some 2,000 paces between banks and still widening, save that the current ran so clear, even near the banks where it was slowest. It seized the cog as it cleared the inflow and swept it onward, swaying and wallowing till Trikegar's crewmen trimmed the sails. The spray that reached Elaf's lips tasted salt. With the wind at their beam now, even the unwieldy cog could race the clouds above, and the banks swept by them at a great rate. Ere the light left them, the lie of the land was changing, and when they rose at dawn, it might have been another country altogether they sailed through. The grasslands had gone, and in their place the rivers shone between steep hillsides, riven by deep valleys through many of which other tributaries flowed. It was often at such confluences that they came upon more towns, or more castles, muttered Elaf, as the channel carried them close beneath age-blackened fortifications. "Seems they're the same thing here, never one without the other." They had been 2 days now upon the great river, and he was growing sick of the sight of them. From the smallest tower perched high on a promontory above the water, the nest of marauding osprey, to the vast and sprawling fastness that filled whole hilltops, or hunched upon the lower lands like some beast snarling over its kill.
"Well, so is it with us,"
Rock pointed out.
"Everywhere larger than a village has its own walls, its own strong place or citadel."
"Yes, but as a refuge, a defense chiefly, never to dominate the place as do these. Every one built as both palace and garrison, as was Morvanic at the first, a home for lord and the stony kernel of his power. Even the larger towns herd like sheep around the feet of the fortresses, and they cast a long shadow over the countryside. Nobody, villager, cottager, or outdweller, could hope to live free of it." He nodded his head at the blanketing of fields beyond the walls, and the rows of minute figures who toiled in them. "Do you look there? Never an orderly checker of single fields and farm holdings, such as you'll see around any town of ours. Just a great sprawl of huge fields, and a few small strips at their edges. The same with the vineyards on the hillsides. always the same, a lord's holding, a master's portion.
Aye, and who works it for him, I wonder?
Rock gazed at the toilers under the hot sun.
I wonder. I'll be damned careful how I ask.
They passed by many more towns in the days that followed, and large or small, all wore the same aspect. Strong fortresses of yellow stone, or a curious patchwork of yellow and brown, their peaked roofs usually red-tiled or of black slate, gathered their flock of lime-washed houses tight within high yellow walls. Beyond those walls, the larger towns might have a quarter of ramshackle huts, but never more, save where here and there some ancient and august ruin arose. In those towns, many of the houses rose several stories high, as if they were plants constrained to shoot upward. They had few windows on their outside walls, and looked somewhat fortress-like themselves. The great river was widening swiftly now, and the towns of the southward shore had long been no more than blurs even to Elof's keen sight. However, the cog kept close to the northward bank, and so brought him closer sight of those there, the more so as by many of them Trikegar would slacken sail, or even heave to altogether, till flag or trumpet gave him the signal to proceed. But by some, notably those on the offshore islands, he would clap on all sail and steer swiftly out into the choppier open waters. Evidently, there were places the king's pennon was no passport. At one point, where a pair of squat, square forts sat flanking the channel between a town on a promontory and an offshore island, he called the soldiers on deck and raised strong mantles along the side. The travelers were ignored, but Elof loosened Gorthar in its sheath. Rock fetched his heavy bow from the deck tent, and together they joined the watchful sergeant on the stern castle. His coarse face seamed with surprise when he saw them, and he unbent slightly. "You do well to help us, sirs," he said, his pale, bloodshot eyes weighing them up. "For this one, I doubt not, would slit the throats of emissaries as freely as common soldiers." "Fitting we share in the defense, then," answered Elof crisply, as the towers glided by above the slatted screens, staring down with blank slit eyes. "For I doubt not we'd bleed the same color." The sergeant eyed them with even sharper surprise. "True enough, sirs. But there's many that might not ha' said that," he added, and strode stiffly off to order some mantles shifted astern. The old shipmaster nodded approvingly. "Bleed the same colour. Aye, that's the right line to take with that one, or myself for that matter. Told him you were worth twice the popinjays we're used to deal with. The same colour." He laughed quietly. "Well, let's hope it won't come to that. Shouldn't. If we seem odd enough, he's no fool, this lordling here. Pays his dues, sends his levies to the king. Not a word out of place. But still, from time to time, boats vanish along this stretch, and he fares better than that starveling townlet of his can afford him. Most often such boats as are too weak or too unwary to defend themselves. Easy enough to make such a one vanish entirely. If you've a swift shipyard to strip the timbers and no scruples about the souls on board. He's not the only one doing it by all accounts. No wreckwood to float ashore, no corpses neither." The shipmaster leaned out beyond the mantle to check the progress of the channel. "Aye, but he'll not try anything now. We're well by him already, and the next town's not so far ahead. Still, no harm in keeping the mantles up for now." Elof looked back at the suspect town. It seemed quite large. An evil thing, If it's true, unlikely it could happen in our land. There we tend to gather in one great city, and the outlying towns and holdings are small and weak by comparison.
Why, so we do here also, chuckled Trikar. Do you think these towns you've seen are of any size? Then it's clear you've never looked upon Caris. Caris itself, Caris the city, Caris the golden. Not the largest of the towns we've passed. Not Carulin of the 5 castles in the south can stand compare with Caris itself. You call cities overseas, then? 10 cottages and a boyer?
Though the raillery was kind enough, Elof could not help bridling. There's no denying the breadth and richness of this land, shipmaster. It's a legend among us. But so is Morven the Great, that the ice laid waste. And Rockhere and I have walked among its ruins. It took us a day to cross its southern quarter alone.
Trikgar raised his brows. A right noble place, then. A fit match for Carulian, or better, perhaps. But Caris now, just its port quarter. But why do I waste my spittle, eh? Only another se'nnight, and you shall see for yourselves.
A week? Exclaimed Rock, when he had digested the unfamiliar expression. But we've been 6 days in this damned boat already.
Trikgar shrugged. Such is Caris, my lad. And I can nor widen nor shrink it to suit you, nor speed my ship. She makes some 9 knots already, by the mean, and that's as fast as you'll find of her build.
No offense to her or you, shipmaster, said Rock abashed. I was startled, that's all. The more so because I knew we were sailing swift. 9 knots. But that makes the distance.
Some 400 leagues and 50, confirmed Trikgar soberly.
Rock whistled. As long as the old Southlands and Northlands together.
And that is only to Caris the city. The lands extend beyond that, perhaps half as much again, perhaps more. Boundaries are uncertain, out in the farthest east where prowl the eaters of men.
The east? Elof caught the old shipmaster by the arm. The Equesh, you mean?
Why, who else? That's where the devils first appeared, and then all along the Northlands that were my kinsfolk once, skulking along the margins of the ice. A few at first, then small raids and sharp assaults, larger raids that were harder to beat back. 100 years of harassing us and dividing us, till a great force worked their way westward and fell upon the gate that we never dreamed they'd dare. But east's where they come from. Some say their homeland's out that way, 4 upon 4. I wouldn't know. I've no desire to go visiting there, I'll tell you.
But in our land they came from the west, blazed Elof, not caring how he overrode the old shipmaster. He was boiling like a lidded cauldron. Over the sea, across the ice, but always from the west, where their homeland was said to be. He swallowed. You do see, don't you, how they came to be on the seas of the sunrise, without first passing through our land? East one way, west the other. Oh, no, exclaimed Rock hollowly. In hell's name, do they hold so much of the world already, these savages, that they can spread 2 ways around it? They do not, said Elof quietly. But the ice, yes, it does. And whither it can send them, they will go. A great change is coming, she said, and it totters in the balance. Powers.
Ours indeed, said Rock darkly. This is their fight, not ours. What's there for such as we to do against the likes of that force? Might as well fight one of these fire mountains, halfway around the world. The more I learn of it, the lesser I feel.
Elof shook his head. Yourself, perhaps, who wouldn't? But as a folk? As a kindred? No, Rock, we're not small. Remember this. Where there's been unity and order, free men with free minds, there the ice has made little headway. It fears the strength that makes us human. And if Morvenhall can resist it, if this vast realm of Karis can only stay both ordered and free...
Oi, said Trikar quietly. If, indeed.
They looked around at him, but his taciturn mask had dropped like a gate of blank iron. The only answer he would give to their question was,
You'll see, lads. It's not for the likes of me to say. You'll see it soon enough.
The week that followed was all days of hot sun and cool wind, brisk but easy sailing that sent the cog skipping ponderously along the riverine coast, like an old horse released into green fields and acting the colt once again. Green fields indeed carpeted the banks, pasture land whose well-tended richness contrasted with the empty lands westward. Towns, however, were few. It seemed rather to be divided up, as were the lands around Kerbrasheim, into a few great farming estates whose manor houses dominated the landscape. One such they approached quite closely, an ancient-looking and nobly proportioned building of age-darkened stone, perched atop a hill spur overlooking the river. Below it at the bank a fortified tower, squat and brutally ugly, huddled over a well-sheltered landing stage. But as the cog drew nearer, the house took on a very strange aspect. And they soon saw why. It was no more than a facade, a ruin gutted and stripped from the back, hardly higher than the ground.
Aye, it's a crying shame,
agreed Rock.
A grand-looking place, yet it's that toad of a tower they've chosen to rebuild first.
Even as he spoke, the cog had drawn close enough to the tower to make out the high scaffolding lashed together out of stripped wooden poles, writhing with the shapes of men like ants in a tree. But Elof peered at the construction for a moment and shook his head grimly. Rebuild be damned. He pointed at the wall as they glided past. Build. Look at that wall. See now where the checkerboard pattern comes from? Those stones, they've been well weathered, but not where they lie now.
You mean?
Rock brushed back his red hair with both hands.
Hella's tits! Do you mean they're tearing down a good, sound hall to build that overgrown jakes? They must be running daft.
Or fearful.
Daft, I still say. If they're so afraid, why don't they get together with a neighbor or two and build a proper-sized castle? One they might just be able to defend properly.
Elof grimaced. Well, even in our lands, not everyone cares over much for neighbors. And here, it seems they don't trust 'em.
Wait you, though,
said Rock sharply.
We've seen that pattern on half the walls along the river. Can't all.
Not all, mused Elof, but many, I think. Casualties of a time when men need strength more than comfort or fair craft. and too long a time to blame on the Ekwesh, I fear.
Aye, there's trouble in this land, right enough. Look where the despoilers come now.
A long dray, drawn by a team of many horses, was laboring down a road that wound from hill to shore. It flexed strangely as it rode, for it was made of many sections, each with its own wheels. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the stone it bore. As it arrived at the foot of the tower, a gaggle of men slouched out and scrambled up to begin unloading. Elof could not see what happened next, but there was a sudden confused swirl at the side of the dray, and a rumbling crash drifted out over the water. Its load was indeed stone, but a good half of it lay in a heap to one side, amid a rising fountain of dust. Evidently, its unloaders had been careless. Men were sprawled among the mess, or groggily picking themselves up. Others strove to calm the startled horses. More men came running, but not to help. Rock leaned over the rail and cursed aloud at the sight. Elof was too shocked. The fallen were being kicked and pummeled to their feet, cowering under a rain of blows to head or body from what might have been cudgels or short whips. Even some of the horse holders were being dragged away and thrashed till they sprawled upon the ground. Then the cog passed beyond the curve of the tower, and the scene was hidden from them. Rock glared at Elof, his face turned so white with anger that the freckles blazed beneath his tan.
Well,
he said with dangerous evenness,
what do you make of that, then?
Elof felt the muscles of his own face tighten. Much as you, I guess. Do you say it? Rock growled.
Those farm workers, and now these. Maybe they're free folk swinkering for pence, ready to swallow a blow, but I wonder. Hell's gape, but I wonder. You never had a chance to know Kerbrahine ere the Ekwesh changed all, and then Kermorven. But there were many reckoned it was heading down a bad road, with no strong lord to rein in all the little lordlings on their own land. Hireman and tenant being bound to the land, to their masters, even more closely till they were free men no more.
Elof whistled softly between his teeth. And of all our lands, Kerbrahine was ever said to be the most like Karis.
Aye, so perhaps what was happening there had already happened here, grown from the same roots, maybe.
He snorted.
Villanage, serfdom, whatever they chose to call it. Common thraldom's my name for it, and this place stinks of it.
Elof glanced around and nudged Rock. He had almost felt the eyes on the back of his neck. There in the stern castle stood the sergeant, apparently exchanging a few words with Trikegar, but his gaze was unwavering in their direction. Maybe, but best we say no more of this for the moment. Mouth shut.
And eyes open, grunted Rock. As you say, Master Smith. I'm not sure I can find fit words anyway.
But thenceforth, there were no more alarms, few excitements of any kind. The mantles were never again raised, and no more towns avoided. The sailing was calm, and save for the fire mountains, the sergeant had promised, they saw no more such disturbing sights upon the shore. In fact, there were few excitements of any kind. They saw little that was new, and what there was, such as a lava stream that flowed right down into the waters and turned them to steam, They could not stop to explore. Rock sought to make the best of his enforced idleness, but Elof paced like a wild beast caged. However much rest the delay gave his body, he could find none in his heart. The appearance of any town, however small, was a welcome distraction. They would lean over the rail and strain their eyes to make out more of this enigmatic land. But they learned little, till the first time they passed a town by night. It struck Elof then how few lights showed, given its extent. Just like Morvanic when the Equesh held it, he remarked to Rock.
You're not ruddy well suggesting.
No, not this deep within the land. But Morvanic had already been struck by plague, and lost 2/3 part of its folk. Here also, it seems there are fewer folk than there should be, than there were, for they would hardly build whole streets of houses they do not need. Empty land at the borders, empty towns in the heartland. Rock grew thoughtful.
Not nice. But there's other things than plague could cut down a folk thus. War, for example. Not necessarily with outsiders. Remember that burned out village?
Elof nodded. Though we've seen no more, it could simply be that Karis the city has drawn too many folk, leaving the rest bereft and dwindling, as Morven did to Morvanic.
Which'd go some way to explain border banditry. Nobody who counts cares much about it, 'cause they all live weeks away. Could be. But we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? Not long now.
No, said Elof explosively. Not long. And then...
What then? You've something in mind?
Elof tapped the rail with his clenched fist, gently. But it was a gentleness of iron restraint. I don't know. I can't be sure. So much depends on what they're prepared to do, and why they haven't already done it. If I only knew more about this land. He gazed in anguish into the night, as if seeking upon the horizon some distant glimmer of the lights of Karis itself. But he was given no such forewarning. 6 nights later they took to their tent, expecting they might see the city in the distance the next day. But around dawn they were both sharply awakened by a clamor of voices and the creak and rumble of tackle, unusually loud. When they scrambled out into the cool air, they found the cog hove to in the midst of a flock of other sails. These were of many types and colors, but they spared them scarcely a glance, for above them towered a vast square sail, golden in the gray dimness, bellied out by the wind. Yet no such wind blew, then or ever, for the sail was of stone, and rode not upon a mast, but 2 slanted pillars of like stone that flanked a vast portcullis gate of dark metal, meshed very close. The waves of the Yscanus slapped about its bars and boomed hollowly in the arch behind. A great sea gate it was, in a wall of the same golden stone higher than the highest of the masts now gathered before it. The breeze drew cold fingers across their skin, but they stayed, for even as they watched, a light golden as the stone climbed up the cloudy sky, and golden also came the cry of distant trumpets, and a call in answer from the wall. Trikar bellowed to his crew, and other shouts echoed him from neighboring ships as the ponderous clank of a ratchet winch echoed out of the arch behind. A great sea gate it was, in a wall of the same golden stone higher than the highest of the masts now gathered before them. Triggar bellowed to his crew, and other shouts echoed him from neighboring ships as the ponderous clank of ratchet winch echoed out of the arch, and the gate began to lift. Water poured from clumps of weed draped over the bars, but the full sheen of the metal beneath was untarnished. Elof nodded quietly to himself. There was fine smithcraft in that gate, such as all the tales said flourished in this land. A sudden excitement arose in him beneath all his other concerns, taking fire at the thought of all the rich smith lore he might find here, and some of the discoveries he might himself unfold. He felt a sudden surge in the deck underfoot, heard the rigging creak overhead as the sails were angled to catch the wind once again, and forgot even that in his eagerness to see beyond the gate. All the other ships were making ready, beamy merchantmen of all shapes and sizes laden with merchandise. Other cogs crowded with armed men and what seemed to be military stores, and a host of barges and lighters of all sizes. In between them slid long, lean war galleys, some ornate and blazing with color, even with ornate canopies on their decks. But the cog, flying the royal pennon, was suffering no dispute over first entrance to the gate. The prow dipped and rose gently as it got under way. Elof and Rock grinned at each other like excited boys, and as one they made a run for the mast shrouds and went swarming up the laddered rigging to the masthead. Most ships had only a spar there to sit on, and possibly a loop for a rope or one's belt. But being a ship of war, the cog had shielded platforms for archers, and the travelers could stand in relative ease to take their first sight of the city at the heart of the world. But for that first moment, Elof felt a keen pang of disappointment. It was a vast expanse he saw stretch out before him through the narrow aperture of the gate, large enough, he guessed, to swallow the two greatest living cities of his land, but it seemed to have not a half of their grandeur. The sun was not yet over the curve of the world, and the distance was no more than a shadowy frieze against the luminous sky, broken only by the looming silhouette of a jagged hill. Over the nearer part of the city, the morning mists rolled like slow waves down towards the great river, for the land was well nigh flat. He could see that it had a network of ancient walls, many times greater than those of which Kerberheim was so proud. But the level ground made them so much less impressive than Kerberheim, rising on a steep and ancient volcanic rock, or Morvenhall on its high promontory above the sea. The stolid bulk of the distant hill served only to diminish them further. Nor could he see any likeness of the noble masonry which made Morvenhall so fair, towering on its rust-red terraces above steep streets. If there was any, it was lost among the welter of lesser roofs. Worse, he could make out no axis, no heart to the city, no equal to the citadel of Kerberheim, ivory-hued under towers roofed in bronze and gold, nor the darkly graceful palace of Morvenhall, its carved column and galleries weathered to the shade of long shed blood, with its lesser palaces on the terraces below. This has overgrown itself, he thought contemptuously, become bloated with its own vigor, and now simply shapeless, a mere tangle of walls and streets. But then the sun arose, and laid its first honors of scarlet and gold across the true regality of Caris. What till now had been lost in black silhouette blazed into life, and left Elof staring, unable to believe what he was seeing. He turned to Rock, and found him wide-eyed, agape, one hand clutching at his fiery tangle of hair. The sheer expanse of Caris the city was greater than they had guessed. but that alone could not have daunted them so. It was the sun's slow progress across the jagged slopes above that held their gaze as by rivets. For hill there was none. Over wall upon wall of sand-hued stone that rich light played, through high arch and carven buttress, over terrace, court, and gallery and colonnade, behind turrets of every size and shape, and across the two high towers joined by a wall that were its crown. Towers curved and shaped into a stylized shape that suggested the horns of some vast bull. The height alone of that vast edifice was astounding. It reared above the mists like some lonely island in the ocean, and looked as ancient as immovable. And all of this the sunlight turned to gold. That first sight of it sent a cool shiver of awe through mind and body. Higher rose the red rim, hanging behind those crags of masonry like a mantle of fires, and higher yet, till to the astonished eyes of the watchers it seemed to settle between those graceful twin towers, rest upon that wall like a brilliant gem set in the crown of the world itself. For so it had been contrived with vast care by those who built the castle and the shore walls long ago, that around dawn each day the sun should be seen so from the first gate to open, appearing to hang there for a time, and from the last gate to close at evening, as the sun's road shifted with the seasons. So also the choice of gates, for there were many. Not the sight alone held Elof rapt, but the concept behind it, and the cunning. It was contrived, that effect, with an equal insight into the paths of the heavens and the ways of the minds of men. Those who lacked wisdom would be astounded, and those who had it would still be daunted by appreciation of the skill involved. Yet about that majestic citadel itself there was nothing monstrous, as there might have been. Some stark tower or castle of that scale might have spoken more of folly than of grandeur, of brutal domination rather than airy strength. It might have loomed like a threat above that great sprawl of humanity beneath. Instead, it seemed to grow out of it. This was no single heap of stone, no one palace or fortress. This was a palace many-fold, a city in itself of 100 levels, as if an astonishing host of halls and towers, tall and fair, had somehow been caught up in a web of woven stone, or in the tangles of some petrified tree. It was as if the city itself reached upward towards the sun and offered it a throne, as if its moving spirit sought to embrace the radiant source of life itself. That noble vision held the travelers hard in thrall as the cog glided smoothly towards the gate. Then, all too abruptly, and with no more than a shout of warning, the spell was shattered. The cog heeled violently as the helm was thrust hard down, lurching dangerously for such a top-heavy craft. Rock and Elof clung frantically to the mast as it swung, their feet scrabbling uselessly against the sudden steepness of the floor planks. A soldier on the deck below was less lucky, and slid down it to crash painfully against the starboard rail. The cog swung upright with a force that threatened to hurl the watchers from the masthead, and he lay groaning in the scuppers. Across the river from the southward, on a huge square sail even less wieldy than the cogs, came the largest ship Elof had ever seen. A monstrous, broad-beamed barge half as large again as the longest dromond of his homeland. Low in the water with a heavy load, It wallowed sullenly even in the calm waters of Yscanius, and the two galleys escorting it seemed torn between keeping close to lend support and darting away lest it might roll over on them. Lesser traffic scattered before it, and Trikeguard and his sailors let out a fearful volley of oaths as the vast thing cut unheeding across the cog's bow. "Grain from the south," he spat, as if it were a foulness in itself, "takes precedence over all else afloat, by my lord king's edict. Does that bloated bastard breeder, and acts as if there's naught else on the bloody river." The great craft glided on regardless, and he swung the helm around again, scarcely more gently, to fall in behind it. "And yet," said Elof breathlessly, still clinging to the masthead, "I can see why, after a fashion. That monster was so overloaded that any sudden check in its course would risk swamping it completely."
"Then why in hell's name must they load it so?"
Rock snarled, as the cog glided into the archway, and the boom of the water echoed deeply about them. "Because they need so much, I guess. Look at the size of this place. And with craft as crude as that, they must need to wait for the fairest winds. Rock, I don't think these folk are very good sailors. They're shipper of kinds we've long since laid by."
"Hardly surprisingly, with naught but an overgrown river to play on. But this last Varia they all swear by. Our ancestors were braver than we thought, if they made that crossing in tubs like these. Or just plain daft."
"Well then, we may have some things of value to teach them." The cog cleared the archway and came out into a wide basin lined with stone quays. All were worn with age, and one or two were crumbling, collapsing into the waters of the dock. But whatever their view of repairs, evidently those in charge here believed in wasting no time on vital cargoes. The huge grain barge was already moored, and a chain of hunched figures were filing down onto its deck. The first were scrambling back up the quay, bowed double under huge sacks. Nothing visible drove them. Perhaps they were eager for some extra payment for speed. Yet he had seldom sensed so tangible an air of frantic haste and unhappiness. He could not hear one of them shout or laugh, let alone sing as did the dock workers of his own land. Freemen or serfs, they were driven indeed. That sight, and the image of the fallen stone, brought back what the glorious vista had driven from their minds. They were silent for a moment, for it seemed almost impossible to reconcile the two visions. But Rock echoed Elof's own, though, when he added,
"Maybe. If we can trust them. If."